good morning, everybody. It looks like we've now got critical mass. We are expecting hundreds of people. And first of all, I'd just like to welcome you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good midnight to some of you. Before we start, I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Darcy Winslow. I'm president of the Academy for Systems Change. And this past year for the Academy has just been one of tremendous growth and expansion and deepening of our work within the Academy. And a couple of examples, we're now into our second year of our second cohort of Academy Fellows. And many of our fellows are joining us today. One is Katie Stubley, who you'll hear from in just a bit. We've also launched the pilot phase of our System Leaders Field Book, which you all can find on our website, and I'll reference that a little bit later, as well as we've begun to collect stories of real work in the field, people who are everyday leaders applying these tools and frameworks and practices in their own work. And we continue to provide free access to the Donella Meadows archive and the incredible work that Dana did over the years. And all of these websites can be found at www.academyforchange.org. So before we get started, I'll tell you just a little bit about how the morning is going to run. Peter is going to start the discussion with Otto, and then we're going to open up for questions. All videos and microphones will be muted. And as questions come in, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Just type in your question at any time. And then when we open the session for questions, we'll be choosing from those. Make sure that you don't send them in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. And also, we will be recording this, and we will send the recording out to everyone shortly thereafter. So first, I get to introduce two of my favorite people in the world. Sitting next to me is Peter Senge. Peter and I have been joined at the hip for about 20 years, and I just continue to learn from him every day. He received his bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from Stanford, where he also studied philosophy. He received his master's in social systems modeling and his PhD in management from MIT. He was also the founding chair of the Society for Organizational Learning, and he is now one of the co-founders of the Academy, our core faculty, and also sits on our board of directors. He's the author of many, many books, but maybe one of the most seminal ever is The Fifth Discipline. And for this book, he was named Strategist of the Century by the Journal of Business Strategy. He and Otto both are senior lecturers at MIT. And as I said, we've been a friend and colleague for 20 years now. And now for Dr. Otto Scharmer. Otto, like I said, is also a senior lecturer at MIT School of Management, and he is the founder of the Presencing Institute. And Otto introduced the concept of presencing, as he'll talk about today, which is really learning from the emerging future. He's the author of Theory U, as well as Presence, along with Peter and Joe Jaworski and Betty Sue Flowers. And his latest book is Leading from the Emerging Future and the Essentials of Theory U, which he'll be talking about today. Both of these guys have had just an incredible influence on my life, and I'm so grateful to both of you for joining us today. And then we also have Katie Stubley from Perth, Australia, and I do think it's midnight her time. So Katie, thanks for hanging in there. Katie is a fellow of the Academy in our second cohort, and she's also been a leader with the Elias program in Australia. And the Elias program is about leaders innovating across sectors. And she's been a practitioner of Theory U in homelessness and regenerative design of food systems. And she'll be talking about that a little bit more today. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Darcy. Darcy says we're connected to hip, but we actually aren't usually sitting hip to hip like we are today. I just happen to be out here visiting her in Oregon, which is really nice, except the sun doesn't shine. But that's, not news in Oregon. So I'm just going to say a word or two to further the introduction of Otto, Otto came and joined our group, which I think at the time was called the Center for Systems Thinking and Organizational Learning at MIT in the mid-1990s. He had, and his wife Katrin had come from Germany, where they had completed their doctorates and were really doing really interesting work. And it was one of those wonderful little fortuitous bits of history when all of a sudden, partners show up. I mean, I don't think Otto and I had ever met prior to him coming. And it was such good fortune to have him come and join this group, which was very formative. And I think he then in turn played a big part in how it did unfold. I don't think I need to say very much more. I know a lot of you are here because you know Otto and you know his work. He's been becoming more and more a visible and distinctive voice, not just in the world of change and system change and leadership development, but I think a little bit beyond that. One of the things I really appreciate about Otto, I don't think I've ever said this about anybody. Otto's actually trained as an economist. And that's a kind of, I didn't mean to be quite as snide sounding as it probably came across, but having been in a building in MIT at that time, we were still in the building at the one time had only building in the world that had 3 Nobel laureates in economics under one roof. A man named Paul Samuelson, who some of you may have heard of, one of the kind of inventors of modern economics. And generally speaking, I've had a pretty negative view, and we usually fought. We were the systems people, and they were the economists. We almost never agreed on anything. But that said, of course, the field of economics is terribly important for understanding how our societies work. And Otto has been doing an extraordinary job his whole career, in a way, of bridging between deep change and you might say the mainstream, because in many ways in our societies, the mainstream is an economics worldview, because that worldview so dominates how our governments work, the priorities we set as societies, like ever increasing GDP, and our whole mindset. Like everything could be falling apart, but if the economy is growing, we're doing okay. At least that's the story we tell ourselves. So having someone who's able to kind of connect and communicate into that world has meant a great deal. And I think it's having a big impact on how this whole field develops. So I'm going to just turn it over to Otto and let him tell a little bit of the story. It's been a very personal story at one level, because in many ways, when he first came to MIT over 20 years ago, the seeds of Theory U, presencing, and leading from the emerging future were very present. I mean, he came with that work in mind, and he and Katrin had been shepherding that for a good long time. So, Otto, take it away.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me into this circle, and for your introductory remarks that actually spark a lot of great memories in my mind. And in fact, I came to MIT it's almost like 25 years ago, because I read The Fifth Discipline. I read work of Ed Schein and also Bill Isaacs coming out of the MIT Learning Center back then. And I was intrigued by a place that brings together action researcher from across, not only across campus, but also across city, with Chris Argyris and other leading really minds and figures in the field of action research and organizational learning, together in a center, in a research center that is really focusing on practical experiments with real organizations. So that's really kind of what drew me to applying to the MIT Learning Center back then. And it has been one of the great gifts of my life that, I actually got accepted. you and Bill and the other members of the Organization Learning Center kind of invited me back then. And the other piece, I think that was kind of one piece. The other piece why I was really interested in joining the center was that when you read the fifth discipline and kind of the whole notion of personal mastery and so on, yes, there was no explicit mentioning of spirituality and, you know, a collective consciousness, you know, a dimension. That was kind of more implicit back then. So today we will talk and do the framing of that more explicitly. But you could clearly sense that kind of this is a place that this is written, and this is kind of a place it's coming from an awareness that is mindful of that deeper dimension, kind of the deeper sources from which kind of reality, both social reality, but also societal reality, really prompted me really to seek the connection and and you know, it was like something that was not really strategic in any way, but I could feel it, right? I could feel it in my heart. I could feel it in my whole body that this is where the future lies. So that was really the beginning. And if I may kind of switch, if I may switch on I have a few pictures to show maybe along the story here. So let me just find the slide mode. So if you look at this, so really what drew me to Peter's group was really what you see here, which is systems thinking, right? Systems thinking kind of applied from a deeper worldview, you could say. And what is systems thinking? It starts with the distinction between symptoms and root issues, right? And, you know, systems thinking then helps you to not react against the symptoms, but address some of the deeper root issues. And if you, you know, look at these kind of three layers here, structures or thought or kind of, you know, frameworks or mental models, and then source, kind of the deeper sources. You know, instead of source, we might have also written there a consciousness or something, but it's the sources of our creativity, of our energy, kind of, and of who we are. Then you can, you know, if you take these four levels together, that's kind of something that you could call awareness-based systems change. And I would say that has been really emerging from, you know, the past 20 years of working together between Peter and I with a number of colleagues really from around the world, not only here at MIT, but, you know, it's Katie, it's Darcy, it's kind of many others, of course, here in the loop and here in the conversation. So if I would summarize awareness-based systems change kind of with three sentences, here's what they would look like. So the first one is, you cannot understand a system unless you change it. Of course, the famous word by Kurt Lewin, kind of, which really is the founder, kind of, who in the 1930s went from Berlin to the East Coast after Hitler took power in Germany, and has been one of the main founders of what today we call action research and action learning, and which was the real reason for me coming kind of to the United States from Europe. Number two, you cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. I would say kind of that's the one sentence summary, not only of Theory U, but, you know, of, you know, many of our experiences really, and I'm sure many of your experiences. So if we just tinker with structures or you know, or institutional kind of outer aspects of the reality, there's only so much we can really change. Profound change requires a shift in consciousness from ego system awareness to ecosystem awareness. And that's really what in all the projects, kind of all the more, challenging projects, I think we try to bring about. And the third sentence is really addressing the how, because at the end of the day is how really do we do that? And, the perspective we would take from a theory U perspective, from a theory U angle, I would say, is this: you cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system sense and see itself. So I would say in the earlier days, kind of, the more kind of earlier incarnation of systems thinking, you would probably have said you cannot transform a system unless you make the system see itself. And that's already quite a progress. But often, of course, we deal with the knowing-doing gap, right? What's the crisis of our time? It's not that we don't know what needs to happen. We know exactly what needs to happen. It's the knowing-doing gap. And what we learned, not only in the Learning Center, but with many other projects, Peter, I, and others were involved, is kind of that to really kind of bridge the knowing-doing gap, you really you need to move beyond just making the system see itself, which is still stuck in the head to some degree. But you need to unlock the heart of the collective, so to speak, by activating the senses. You need to make the system sense and see itself. And hence, kind of in theory U, the emphasis on all the learning journeys and all the kind of refining of perceptive capacities, opening the mind and the heart and so forth. We'll come to that later. But that's basically the summary up front. So if I were courageous, I would stop here and then, So that's basically the essence, kind of, and everything else I'm going to share is a little bit like footnotes on that, right? And the first footnote is, of course, when you look at the symptoms, kind of the ecological divide, the social divide, the spiritual divide, that could be a framework that also applies to the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that you all are familiar with, I'm sure. Our colleagues in Indonesia kind of have come up with that framework because it's also relating to the Balinese philosophy of Trihita Karana, of kind of the 3 ways to happiness, by bridging exactly the same divides. So why are these things so difficult today? And what is the bigger kind of, Peter was referring to the bigger picture, kind of that in which systems thinking and systems change is happening right now, which is, on the one hand, kind of the transformation of the economy, but it's also the transformation of society at large, including kind of politics. And I just want to maybe spend 2 minutes or so on, just pointing you towards a possible perspective, how to make sense of what's currently going on, particularly the last 2 or 3 years in our macro environment, which is the axial shift in politics, in economics, and in culture and learning today. And so the first one is shifting the political, the political coordinates from a discourse that happens between left and right to a discourse that happens between closed and open, or ego to eco. And of course, you're all familiar kind of with the more recent events, a liberal democracy in Eastern Europe and all the tendencies towards autocracy, the crisis of democracy. I just give you a few names here. And you know that there has been enormous amplification of the lower half, right? The 20th century discourse between left and right basically was a difference in ideology. But the 21st century politics that we are now entering into, which is the one kind of that is not only left-right, or not even primarily left-right, but something between closed and open, has to do with a difference in consciousness. So the practical work for us is then, how do we help ourselves and groups and institutions and communities move that are locked into the lower half progress into the upper half of this system. And when you kind of look behind and look at the operating systems, of course, you have on the lower half the amplification of fear, hate, and ignorance, while on the upper half, in order to move there, you need to build the capacity of curiosity, compassion, and courage. So that's basically why we are here in this conversation, kind of. So how do we build vehicles for that? And of course, I could go more into detail here, but we see kind of these behaviors of blinding, desensing, absencing, and so on all over, of course. But the real question is how to build the capacity to move from the lower to the upper territory. How does that shift happen in the economy today? So we see a shift from the old economic discourse between government interventions versus market mechanisms, Keynesianism versus kind of neoliberalism and so forth, to a new one, which is between GDP and well-being for all. So that's really kind of the shift of economic discourse that, of course, many of us already participate in. And then the third axial shift, I would say, is kind of in learning and educational systems, from public versus private to an old model that focuses on memorizing figures, formulas, facts, to a new one that focuses on whole child or whole person and whole systems approaches, and that is focusing on activating generative social fields, which is kind of another bigger initiative kind of that Peter and I and others are currently undertaking in a variety of contexts. So if you take these things together, what's the real issue here for us? The real issue is systems leadership. And when you look at this matrix, you see kind of already kind of what's wrong with our current focus, which is that so this is, mapping the field of systems leadership according two dimensions. Kind of one is depths, kind of so the progression from, head-centric ways of learning to head and hand, like, for example, coaching and other things where we reflect on practice, to transformative formats of learning that, integrate head, heart, and hand. So that's kind of the deepening of the learning cycle, right, when you go up here. And then the other dimension is, of course, kind of the system, bringing in the whole system from the individual to the team, to the organization, to the ecosystem. So where do all the resources go today? Here. So that's kind of, so mostly training is and learning is limited to the head and limited to the individual. So we put skills on individuals and then we throw them into systems and we assume kind of then, change might be happening. And, in a larger context, I think, probably today more than 80 or 85% of all resources move into these four boxes here, right? Kind of, so conceptual or reflective learning environments for mostly individuals, but, in part also teams. Where's the blind flag? The blind spot of this whole thing. So it's everything, related to transformative, right? Even though there are some formats, mostly for individuals, and it's everything related to ecosystems. So I think we as a field, where do we try to move the needle kind of to the, from the bottom left to the top right? Transformative multi-stakeholder action labs. I mean, that's just a working title, but you know what I mean. Kind of, it's kind of so, and that's really so. It's bringing together whole ecosystems, providing environments, so learning environments that are transformative, and that are where the learning environment is wrapped around real-world initiatives. So it's not a training; it's kind of a lab where kind of real-world initiatives are being moved forward. So that's basically what we try to do, and which is reflecting kind of the axial shifts, the three axial shifts that that I shared with you earlier. What does that look like? Well, many different formats, but from if you take theory kind of as like an organizing framework, it looks a little bit like this. So you go through these stages of co-initiating, bringing multi-stakeholder groups together, the co-sensing, which is, looking at the system from all the different angles, particularly from the angles of the most marginalized, with an open mind, open heart, and then kind of moving into deep sense-making kind of environments, what is wanting to emerge here, developing ideas and, and the co-create, then kind of exploring them with small initiatives and, then learning from that and, scaling, bringing them more to scale. What's happening in such a process, a project, other than say, the outcomes, the practical outcomes, it is a mindset shift from seeing reality as something outside of yourself to seeing reality or seeing the system in a way that includes yourself. So, and that in many ways is, the core of systems thinking and systems sensing-based interventions, that you help systems to go through this framework to that shift of mindset. What does that look like? So if you pictures here, that's like sensing journeys, that's kind of one way where that happens. So this is kind of Ant Financial, kind of the biggest fintech in the world, and they are just coming from a half-week-long learning journeys where they mapped and visited the entire business ecosystem in 2 different countries that they have, and then really in a very methodical, structured way saw their own system. Most of them are usually in China, through the eyes of their international partners, with lots of insights that they had along the journey, and then coming back together and sharing all these, everything that they learn. And you can really see this process of moving from individual learning to learning together, wrapping their arms around the collective situation that they're dealing with based on all the different face-to-face dialogue conversations they had with their stakeholders. Scenario thinking, of course, another tool that can be used to this end, which is making a system sense and see itself. So you're leaning into a variety of emerging futures, and then notice your own reaction and move into a whole company dialogue with that. Another tool we are using to that extent is something we call 3D mapping, creating a map and then making people go through a structured process of reflection. And in this case, it's a project with more than 30 organizations, 150 people, and this event evolves. So they do it on many tables and then visit each other in a gallery walk to see the deeper patterns. Same thing, in a different context, Indonesia. This is another tool, 4D mapping. It's coming out of social presencing theater. And that's you map the whole system of stakeholders, both in terms of current reality, the emerging future, and then have a structured debrief. So it's like this one, except that you're not looking on the sculpture, at the sculpture, you're actually stepping inside the sculpture, right? And that's the 4th dimension. The 4th dimension is time here, that you feel how this sculpture is wanting to change, and then you follow that movement and you debrief that. Same method, different context. Lakeside University, founded by Jack Ma from Alibaba, and that's with a group of tech, founders, CEOs, mapping their transformation in their own company. So again, using social presencing theater here. And then, of course, moving into spaces of nature, solo experience in nature, deep circle and, silence, solo in nature, and then circle conversations based on that as one of the deeper methods that we often use, and in many, and I'm sure many of you have been using that is at the foundation, of our methodology, and happens to, be situated at the bottom of the U. UN SDG leadership labs, kind of, we recently started to work with, UN in a number of countries. And so that's a much more like conservative mainstream environment, yet kind of you bring in some of these tools, and it is very surprising actually how big the impact is. And it's mostly because the lack of the access to these tools maybe in these environments before. This is a reflection group in Alibaba, and so 8 different teams reporting on what they did with awareness-based systems change, theory U. And my main takeaway from listening to them and then discussing with them was that there was an over-focus on tools and an under-focus on container building. So that's kind of maybe the headline, and maybe Katie can also talk to that a little later in a few minutes when we turn it over to you, Katie. So I remember one of them reported about a feedback. So the person, kind of the team member, told her, "Why are you doing this onto me?" Right? So the others felt like they were applying the tools onto them. And that's kind of a clear indicator that there was a lacking container. So in other words, often kind of people like Peter and I, we emphasize tools and methods, and it's all good, and it's all good and well, but the reality is tools are 20%, right? The 80% is the invisible part, and that a lot of that has to do with the inner place from that you operate, and also the container that you create in a group. So wrapping this up, I asked this question: how do we create formats for the top right? That's the bigger question, I think, for us as a whole field. And from the Presencing Institute perspective, I would say we have done 2 things. One is the labs that I just described to you, right? Kind of you bring together a team, and then you move a group through these different stages that I indicated. But the problem with that is it's very expensive, right? It takes a lot of resources, a lot of intention. So the real question is, if you want to go to systemic impact, how do you bring that to scale? So how do you create these formats at marginal cost close to zero? And so that's where we have like 2 or 3 little experiments, little or not so little. So one is kind of the ULab MOOC, kind of that, we started 5 years ago, and it basically moved into creating like an ecosystem of communities that, are somehow connected with each other. So 120, let's just leave it like that. So a lot of good influence, but also some limitation, because it's often stays at the individual level and at an aspirational level for systems change, but not the realization of systems change. So it's providing the soil for systems change, but not the substance necessarily. So that's what led us into 2 more directions. One is regional focus. This is Ubuntu Lab, doing basically something like ULab in Africa. And the other one is something we launched yesterday, which is ULab S for societal transformation, which is basically an infrastructure for teams. It's 300 teams with 3,000 to 4,000 change makers across 5 continents, working together over the course of the next 4 months, going through basically the process you see outlined there, and I indicated before: co-sensing, co-inspiring, and so on. Each month you do a different practice, and we role model that practice. So yesterday we did it with an MIT class that runs in parallel to this process during this spring term. And it was the 3D mapping. Next month it will be 4D mapping, and so on. So basically the stuff I shared with you before. But in this case, we do it not just with 1 team, it's 300. And they all work, the whole coaching will be peer-to-peer based. You had to apply, so there was a relatively significant entry threshold. It's free of charge, but you needed to fit these criteria. And we are very excited because it feels like 5 years ago, we really crossed the threshold with moving into ULab. And now with ULab S, focusing on various key acupuncture points of societal transformation and linking people across geographies around these key issue areas feels like another significant step where we move from, activating and linking individuals kind of more to the collective dimension, more to linking teams, place-based teams that collaborate with each other and that share a lot in common in terms of what they want to do. So that's basically what I had to share. Kind of, so I feel that with that, Peter, Katie, Darcy, myself, and I assume kind of all of you, kind of we are part of a larger movement here that deals with bridging the three divides, and that is focusing on addressing kind of addressing these divides in ways where we make methods and tools available that not only focus on the outer change, but also on the inner change on the side of the change maker. And that's pretty much, what I sensed as a possibility kind of when I applied kind of to joining MIT and joining Peter's group at MIT some 25 years ago. And that's kind of what, in the meantime, has been manifesting really more as a movement that, in which not only, the four of us here on the panel today, but many others are participating. And I think it's a movement that to some degree is aware of itself, but in most cases is not even aware of itself. So in other words, there's many people working vehicles that make that movement or larger ecosystem sense and see itself. And yet kind of this kind of providing mechanisms for sensing and seeing yourself as a system is the heart of systems thinking, as I said at the outset. So this is kind of really the intriguing moment I think we are in as a movement and as a society right now. And so I'm so happy, Katie, that you are also part of this conversation, because what happens, what's the critical bottleneck in many projects today right now is we know how to manage projects in these ways that I described, but how do you really activate a whole ecosystem? That's kind of a true threshold and bottleneck for many of us. And, from all the people I know, kind of you're really one of the masters kind of who is embodying that more than really almost any other person I know. So, and I'm not saying that, I'm from Germany, I'm really blunt and I don't know how to say positive things, but I say that really in acknowledgement of what you have been doing there. So it would be really great if you could share a little bit maybe of your own experience, but also on some of the practices that you're using to really activating not only one project or another, but activating a whole ecosystem of communities and of initiatives that keep supporting each other.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that, and thank you very much for that, Otto. I'm very happy, actually, if you could leave that slide up, because I was actually going to talk to that slide, so it was wonderful that you actually ended with that. So I think I lived overseas for a long time, and then I remember I went to the Global Presencing Forum in 2011. I was actually listening to Otto and Peter speak, and it was one of those sort of life moments where I thought, they were talking about place-based activation and here are you and systems change. And it was one of those moments of making a deep commitment to place. So at that point, I returned back to Western Australia, and there's a great community there already. And we sort of made a commitment towards a vibrant, just and sustainable Western Australia. So you can already hear in that vision the overcoming of those three divides. From there, we really began to experiment with these three bubbles. So how do we build capacity in this space? How do we actually convene innovation labs? And how do we actually create knowledge? So one of the things that we wanted to do was actually build capacity at multiple layers. So we've used the ULab. So we've had many ULab hubs. They self-organize. We've got 3 S labs happening at the moment. But at the same time, we've had the Presencing Foundation program. We've also had a tri-sector leadership program for our high-level leaders. And we also teach this in our MBA at our university. So how do you actually hit the capacity building at multiple points so all these different people can actually begin speaking in a shared language in order to create change? We've also, I would say, being in Western Australia, which is known for being one of the most isolated places in the world, we're able to experiment. So we have convened innovation labs of 3 months, sort of 9 months, several years, even days and half days. So we're constantly experimenting with how we can actually create change here. And then we make sure that actually the practitioners between these different initiatives are really coming together to share knowledge and to build that knowledge together, so we can really work towards creating a meaningful place. And I think, so one of the questions I got asked was, where do you get stuck with this work? Or do you find this work easy? And I think in some regards, it makes life very easy because it's a process that works. So, and other ways, there's always quite a bit of resistance in the system to trying something new. So what we often found was, if we laid things out from the beginning of the process, we would get quite a bit of resistance. People would say, I haven't seen something like this before. We need to jump to a solution. And then we just start taking them through it really slowly. And by far the biggest response at the end of it was, Katie, why didn't you tell us about this sooner? This really works. And I think there's some really, Otto's touched on a lot of the points that really make it work. But I just want to point out too, and then we'll hand it back over to questions. So one of the really critical points in all of this work is that seeing and sensing of the system. So what we noticed is a lot of people sort of would say, hang on a second, we have a report in the system, everyone already knows everything, all the information is there. If people were smarter, they would have read it and they would have done something. But actually that just, it creates these individual aha moments. But what we need to do is this deep seeing and sensing together, which creates the collective aha moments, which then actually enables us to shift our thinking and then act from a different place to solve those problems. And I think the other piece, which I just find is so critical, mainly because it seems, particularly where I am, people find it very difficult. And that's moving from sort of a planning and a project culture to actually prototyping. So really shifting into just trying things out, being prepared to fail, experimenting. I was speaking to Darcy the other day and she was saying that, really you can only expect that 15% of prototypes ever work. And I don't think that that's usually how we think of projects. So I think the more that we can develop these capacities in those spaces, the more we can actually create change. So I'm going to hand back over to Darcy to begin asking the first questions to Otto.
Questions to me or to anyone really, kind of in this?
Yeah, I think they're to anybody. I think many might go right to you, but thanks, Katie. Thanks, Otto. That was amazing once again. One of the first questions is from another Academy fellow, Katie Maumon. Hello, Katie. And she asked, does transformative systems change in society inevitably require people or institutions with power to give up or lessen their power? I think that's to you, Otto.
Well, I think it's a question to all of us. I mean, it's a good question. So it's like it's hard to me. It's hard to respond to in abstract, because in reality, so this will be very context specific, and so transformative systems change. If you see the level of inequality in society today, so the asymmetry, kind of how like access to resources is distributed. Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's kind of a fair basic assumptions. Kind of, it requires let go of one side in order to have let come of the other side. So a more kind of more equally distributed access to resources, to opportunities. It requires change on all sides, I would say. So I would generally agree with that statement. I would also say that it's not. So basically, in that question, I would follow Gandhi's spirit, kind of who said there is no kind of evil people, there's only evil structure, right? So in other words, if you fight against the structure that creates inequality or structural violence, so you don't really fight personally against kind of the current incumbents, but you need to think about what is actually their role after the change, kind of after the revolution, whatever you want to call that, kind of after the transformation. And I think that's a very valid question to ask, right? So it's like because there's a whole distribution also of willingness, I think, on the side of the haves to move into a new territory. I think there's like ample evidence for that. But what's the pathway and kind of what do frameworks look like? I think that's where basically help is needed. And that comes to my mind on that question.
Start again.
Oh, excuse me. One question that came up early, I saw it, but we haven't found it, is that you are familiar with this term that's getting thrown around a lot in the U.S., New Green Deal. And, it may turn out to be a pretty useful term. Please, this was the question, please provide some details as to how, as for how this could be practically applied to, let's just say, the new political motif or theme of the New Green Deal.
Well, I mean, let me just say, I have not completely familiarized myself into all the details of the Green New Deal. But let's just say two things. One is, this is the time to think big. So in that regard, kind of coming into this conversation with a bigger aspirational framework is something that's very much welcomed. And I also like about this suggestion that it is focusing, it is acknowledging climate change as a primary challenge that we need to respond to, that is within the next 12 years kind of requiring us to profoundly shift the way we run our economy. And it's not limited to that. It's also kind of focusing on the social dimension. For example, the fact that through automation we'll lose within the next kind of 15 years or so half of our jobs in for example, in developed countries. Therefore, new concepts, how we distribute income, are necessary, that require us to rethink all the old orthodoxies in economic thought. And one suggestion that more and more comes up there, and that is to some degree reflected in the suggestion of the Green New Deal, is UBI, Universal Basic Income. So it's, and then of course you ask yourself, well, how can that? So it's like, it is really in violation of the orthodoxies, which is the only reason why we would work as human beings, is in order to kind of to receive the income, right? So which is kind of still kind of like a very kind of limited view of the human being, right? Which is not kind of perceiving of like that work maybe is part of how we realize our creativity, how we manifest the deeper purpose that we feel in ourselves. So I very much welcome the Green New Deal as opening of a conversation that we really need to have around the bigger picture, which is how to respond to the three divides. At least two of the divides are mentioned in that proposal. And then, of course, so we have like 5 different countries where we have run UBI experiments over the past few years, kind of Finland being one of them. And so there is, I think it is actually a fascinating debate, and it's much needed, and I'm sure it's coming. In this century, we'll see. And it's also clear, where we will end. I think at the end of the day, we will need a global UBI, right? So that's, the trajectory historically. Is that possible today? Of course not. But that's where we are moving, right? And to having not only in Switzerland, not only in Germany, not only in Finland, this debate right now, but also in the US, by also bringing into that the ecological crisis that we are up against, I think is definitely a step in the right direction. All the practicalities, of course, are not answered with this, but that requires a conversation, and that's the right conversation to have right now.
So Otto, building on that question, there's a question here around how do you actually shift the economy in your local area? So that was the big picture thinking, but what steps could people actually take here and now in their own places?
Well, I would be interested in your view on that, Katie. But so we as you know, at the Presenting Institute, we formed a partnership with HuffPost a year ago, where we actually promote the new economic narrative, right? Kind of the new economic mindset and way of thinking, and wanting to make that more, more mainstream. So one part of this initiative is ULET-S, what I already described earlier, kind of this basically global ecosystem activation of a multi-local innovation infrastructure. But the other one is what's happening on the HuffPost side of this partnership, which is that they have a platform kind of where they bring stories, right, around the front line of the new economy, kind of what's dying in the old economy, and new examples. And it's interesting kind of that one of their so there are like 2 topics that really are, and then you track all the stats, kind of which stories get how much downloads and views and page views and so forth. And the 2 areas that really stand out, that get most of the traction globally, but also particularly here in the United States, are farm and food and housing. So those are just kind of 2 like key aspects. And if you then add health and education to it, then you have all the problems we always deal with wherever you are, right? So it's those are, so I would say starting, and when you look at farm and food, what's the big story? I mean, it's huge, the change we have seen over the past 2 decades. I mean, Peter could say a lot more on that with this Sustainable Food Lab and so on, but 20 years ago, who would have thought that kind of like the localization of food, it's no longer a question whether we do it, but how we do it, right? It was impossible 2 decades ago, and now everyone is working on it. Localization and kind of the greening, the sustainability of these food cycles, and also the awareness that some of our economy actually should be global, right? So if I, want a device like this and so on, of course, I don't want the local stuff, right? I want the best devices available. But when it comes to food, the best available is local, right? So not only from an ecological, but from many other aspects. So we begin to differentiate our thinking about where do we want to strengthen the local cycles, and where do we want to strengthen regional, and where maybe kind of a global economy. And so I would say when you look at the new economy movement, a lot happens from farm and food, right? A lot happens really through reconnecting and becoming aware of that all economic activity at the end of the day starts with nature, right? And how we relate to nature and our relationship to nature. And so the farming sector is one of the primary sector if we really want to reshape the economy from scratch. And if we move into a scenario, let's say, climate change and so on, where we will see bigger breakdowns in the years to come, farm and food will be one of the key sectors. So it cannot be emphasized enough. It's very practical because each of us, right, is connecting with nature through farm and food, and just becoming more aware of these cycles and shaping them in a more conscious way. That's certainly one aspect, I would say. And the other one is money, right? What does our money do? Hopefully we're not just giving it to the bank and hope something good is going to happen with that. We live in an age where we need to bring our intentionality, our awareness, just with like the food cycles, a lot deeper into, where we deposit, where we lend, kind of where we borrow. So that whole kind of the role of money in society, kind of, and how we relate, kind of, so how that is related to our own intention and attention is another big topic. So with that, I'm just kind of giving two starting points. Obviously, kind of the answer to that question again is very much depending on also what happens in my community, what happens locally, and should not be generalized.
Thank you.
Thank you, Otto. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. And I remember you saying at one Executive Champions workshop in Vermont that you wrote Theory U in 600 pages, and yet you have the ability to describe it in such wonderful detail with examples in such a short period of time. And I just want to thank you for synthesizing all that for us. Any last word before I kind of close us off for this session?
Well, my feeling is actually I have said enough already, if not too much. So I would actually prefer, hearing a little bit from others. But maybe my closing bit of it is. Is something like that. I think kind of there probably has never been a situation on this planet where the future was so much at risk and dependent on what people do in the now. So everyone alive on the planet right now is enormously privileged because we are part of the story. I mean, we are kind of, particularly those here in the loop, certainly those, the panelists, but everyone here in the loop, we are actually in a situation that we are connected with many others. And so we actually can make small things happen that far out in the future, which is decades, can have huge impacts. So I'm just very aware of this critical moment we're in as a community globally. I'm also aware of that we really live in two realities. One is all the newspaper and the amplification of anxiety and fear and depression, and all of that is real. But underneath, there's a whole other story going on, which is many more people like us in the loop here kind of actually being quite aware of a whole other dimension of our humanity that can be activated and can be influential in reshaping the old system that is about to break down, right? The old economy, the old kind of democratic political process hijacked by, vested interest groups, and also kind of the old learning systems. And, we have these prototypes, they're there. And so the global possibility is right in front of us. I think kind of we are very much in a situation where we can, really without being unrealistic or overly enthusiastic, in a very pragmatic way, build the foundations now that later in this century will allow kind of the people that are now young and later on their children to really manifest what today we can only realize in prototypes. But we can already realize it right now in a way that allows it to really connect to the many of us who actually have an inner leaning towards participating in these stories, but often don't have access. And that's kind of where I feel I want to really put the focus on for the next 10 years, that we create this enabling infrastructure, because the right people are here, the right possibilities are here, the right examples are already here, and the methods and tools, but we haven't quite put it together. It's not a lot that's missing there, but it's something very significant, and that has my attention, and I feel very grateful that I'm alive on this planet right now because I can participate in that, like many of us can.
Great. Thank you, Otto. And that reminds me of something that one of our colleagues once said, that it's the small shifts in habit that actually begin to transform a system, and that we can all have a piece in that. And then the Dalai Lama said at a gathering that we were at that an example of that is if one person smiles, it makes a difference to that one person. If 1 million people smile, it makes a big difference. So we all have a piece in this. So I want to say thank you to Peter and Otto and Katie and to everyone in the background that helped make this happen. It does take a village. And if you feel so inclined, if you found value in this, feel free to support the Presencing Institute and the Academy for Systems Change. $10, $10 million. As Otto said, let's put the money in the right place to keep this work happening. So thank you all very much. And we thank you for all the work that everybody out there is doing as well.
Thank you all.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.